Welcome to the courtroom today. It's not often that we get to witness a moment like this, where the tension is so thick you can almost feel it in the air. Today, we have a case before us that certainly caught the attention of many, and we're about to dive into the details. Let's step into the story together. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the atmosphere felt heavy and charged. The room was full of spectators, all watching closely, murmuring quietly amongst themselves. Everyone was waiting for the drama to unfold. Standing at the defendant's table was a young man, his hands in his pockets and his chin lifted just enough to give the impression of confidence, though the oversized table in front of him seemed to dwarf his frame. Jalen Dawson, just 19 years old, was facing serious charges, resisting arrest and grand theft auto. The charges were severe, and as Judge Walter Grayson observed him, he realized something. The young man before him wasn't just a kid in over his head. He was speaking with the kind of precision and knowledge that suggested he knew more about the law than most people in the room. Judge Grayson's attention sharpened. He recognized that Jalen was more than a teenager who had gotten himself in trouble. He was acting like someone who had studied the system, almost as if he had become a part of it. The air in the room grew thicker as Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers moving rhythmically over the polished wood of his desk. His eyes never left Jalen as he peered over his glasses, his lips twisting into an expression that was half grin, half sneer. "So, you think you're some kind of legal expert?" Grayson asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few light chuckles rippled through the courtroom, mostly from the prosecutor, the bailiff, and the stenographer. Even the audience seemed to find it amusing. But Jalen didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He stood there, calm and collected. To him, this wasn't just another moment of trouble. It was a culmination of years of preparation. Years of listening to his mother, Denise Dawson, a paralegal, recount stories from her job about the inner workings of the justice system. Stories of shortcuts taken by prosecutors, of judges who showed favoritism, and defense attorneys who barely fought for their clients. By the time he was 14, Jalen knew the law better than most law students. While his friends memorized stats or played video games, Jalen had spent his time reading case law, imagining mock trials, and discussing legal theories in his head. He wasn't unfamiliar with a courtroom, though he never expected to be on trial himself. Judge Grayson, however, wasn't impressed. To him, Jalen was just another kid who had gotten into trouble. His expression remained cold as he flipped through the case file. "Let's make this quick," Grayson muttered. "I have a golf game at 2. The remark drew another round of laughter, but this time, something shifted in the room. Jalen's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, a smile that was nearly imperceptible to anyone else, but not to him. He had just seen Grayson make a mistake. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, stood up next, confident and well-prepared. His suit was flawless, his tie perfectly knotted, and his voice carried the assurance of someone who had given the same speech over and over. He turned toward the jury box and began. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught in a stolen 2022 Audi A6. The car had been reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The weight of Carrington's words settled over the courtroom. The audience shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. On the surface, the case seemed clear. A stolen vehicle, a high-speed chase, and an arrest. It sounded like an open and shut case. But Judge Grayson, still peering at Jalen, said nothing. He simply motioned for Carrington to continue. "Go on," Grayson said, his voice flat. Carrington moved toward the jury box, his shoes clicking sharply on the floor. As he made eye contact with Jalen, he added, "But the defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unlucky victim of circumstance. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The room grew tense. Grayson leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand, still studying Jalen. But Jalen remained unmoved, his eyes steady, his posture unwavering. He was absorbing every word, but he wasn't going to speak yet. He was waiting. Carrington continued, flipping through his papers. Here's the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. Grayson nodded slightly, letting out a soft breath through his nostrils. Sounds straightforward to me. To most people in the room, it did sound straightforward. A stolen car, a police pursuit, an arrest. It all lined up. But Jalen, with his years of studying the law, knew better. He had spent too many hours analyzing trials, learning case law, and understanding the little details others might miss. But he remained silent, waiting for the right moment. Finally, Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He then went to Jalen's attorney, a public defender by the name of Lisa Thornton, who had not spoken a single word since entering the courtroom. Anxiously, she rose up and shifted her weight. Your Honor. A quiet plea was made by Jalen as he put his hand on her arm. After some hesitation, she returned to her seat. In addition, Jalen made his first public statement. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. There was a total and utter lack of sound in the room. It was obvious that Grayson was delighted as he glanced at. You're what? Jalen's tone was composed and non-agitated. I'll be defending myself. A muttering could be heard throughout the courtroom. Immediately the bailiff's eyebrows came up. The smile that Carrington was wearing lasted for a fraction of a second before he let out a piercing chuckle. This should be interesting. But as Jalen took his first step forward, nobody laughed because everything was about to change. Jalen's first step marked the beginning of a new era. Jalen became the focal point of the courtroom's gravitational pull. As he adjusted his position, he continued to keep his hands in his pockets. He let the quiet continue for a little while longer, which was sufficient to make them uncomfortable. Finally, he made his voice heard. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. One of Carrington's eyebrows was lifted and he crossed his arms. Go ahead. A cautious move forward was taken by Jalen. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Carrington heaved a quick exhalation, being already bored. That's right, and that testimony is written in his report. As Jalen bobbed his head and turned to face Judge Grayson, he said, Of course it is. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson looked at him with a narrowed gaze. On what grounds? Jalen took his hands out of his pockets for the very first time and made a motion in the direction of the table where the prosecution was sitting. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A momentary expression of perplexity appeared on Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen moved forward while taking another stride. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history. In the air, he let the word linger. I have a feeling it won't. After then, the mutterings in the gallery became more audible. Grayson scowled and cast a glance in Carrington's direction. Grayson triggered it by asking, Counselor. Carrington had cleared his throat while simultaneously tensing his jaw. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? A tiny shrug that seemed almost nonchalant was given by Jalen. He let the statement trail off, saying, If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. However, if he wasn't... After giving him a lengthy period of attention, Grayson switched his attention to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Carrington was hesitant. The delay ended up being just long enough for the jurors to take note of it. The gallery took note of it. Most significantly, the judge took note of the situation. The silent breath was taken by Jalen. He had devoted years to observing cases and learning about the strategies used by prosecutors, as well as the games they played with the system. And there was one thing that he knew without a shadow of a doubt. Carrington would not be delaying if he felt confident in his case. As he rubbed his temple, Grayson let out a groan. "Counselor?" Last but not least, Carrington shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." Nevertheless, the transition had already started. Now, for the very first time, there was no longer any laughter in the courtroom. The atmosphere in the courtroom was calm, but the anxiety was palpable. Despite his polished assurance, Carrington shuffled his papers and his confidence began to crumble at the edges. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." It was impossible to interpret Jalen's expression as he offered a little nod. The statement was made by him. A stride forward was taken by him. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson seemed to be indicating that he should proceed by raising an eyebrow. In order to make eye contact with each member of the jury, Jalen focused his attention on them. "The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means that I stole it. That is the story they are selling. However, let's think about this logically," he said, taking a deep breath and maintaining a calm and controlled tone throughout the conversation. "Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" A few of the jurors looked at each other. During the exhibition, there was a person who said something under their breath. They were not given enough time to recuperate by Jalen. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He waited for that to settle for a while, and then he posed the following question in a voice that was as sharp as a knife on the silence. "Does touching something make you a criminal?" In an effort to recover control, Carrington cleared his throat and flipped through his notes, looking for something, anything, that might help him. This was not Jalen's last act. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. He turned to Grayson in his direction. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" As a result of being taken aback by the question, Grayson blinked. He gave Carrington a quick look. The prosecutor paused for a while before finally uttering the word "no." There was a closeness between Jalen's lips. "Let me get this right," he said. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine, ask about the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis." Carrington's jaw muscled up in strain. Jalen gave a little nod, as if that was all he was required to hear. "Interesting." While he was pinching the bridge of his nose, Judge Grayson let out a sigh. This was the face of a guy who had come to the realization that this case was not going to be as simple as he had thought it would be. However, Jalen was not yet finished, mostly due to the fact that the next statement he was going to make will affect everything. Jalen moved forward in a measured manner, his voice still calm yet resolute. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson wore a frown. "The owner?" Jalen gave a little nod. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that for some reason was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why." Carrington was what he turned to. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" The jaw of Carrington became clenched. It was clear to him what was about to happen. He did not wait for him to respond before Jalen did. Instead, he took a printed copy from his file and read it out loud once he had finished. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A resounding collective gasp could be heard across the courtroom. Jalen had the paper in his hand. That's from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He refocused his attention on Judge Grayson. The arresting officer admitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington took a stride forward while still scurrying. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." Jalen, however, gave a headshake. The courtroom was filled with the precise accuracy of his voice as he said, "No, I wasn't." His voice did not seem elevated. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." While stroking his temple, Judge Grayson exhaled slowly and let out a leisurely breath. The case was rapidly disintegrating, and everyone was aware of this fact. Jalen refocused his attention on the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. There is no sound. Grayson rehearsed his voice and adjusted his spectacles before continuing. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington's face began to flush, and he became rigid. "No, Your Honor." Exhaling, Judge Grayson sighed. After giving Jalen a long look, he turned his attention to the jury for a while. At long last, he leaned forward and said the words that would remain in the minds of everyone there in that room. "Case dismissed." A split second passed, but it felt like an eternity. The words hung in the air like a heavy, unsettling fog. For a moment, the courtroom was trapped in complete, stunned silence, as if no one knew how to respond to what had just been said. The judge's gavel clacked against the surface of the bench, but the sound barely reached Jalen's ears. His heart, pounding, seemed to drown out everything else. Then, like a switch had been flipped, the room exploded. Some people gasped, others let out half-silent prayers of relief, and a few muttered expletives under their breath. The noise reverberated off the walls, murmurs of disbelief, shuffling of papers, shifting in seats. There was a flurry of motion as reporters scrambled to get their notes down, eyes flicking between their pads and Jalen, eager to capture this turning point. Jalen remained unmoved. His gaze was steady, focused, as if he were in no rush to hurry through this moment. He allowed the chaos around him to settle on its own, giving people the time they needed to digest the unexpected turn of events. The judge, still holding his gavel, hadn't moved. His hand seemed frozen in mid-air, the wood tapping against the surface almost absent-mindedly. His eyes were fixed on Jalen, not with the sternness or arrogance that had marked their earlier encounters, but with something else. Something far more layered. There was a glint in his eyes, as if he was seeing Jalen through a new lens. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe even respect. Perhaps there was an unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't just another case for Jalen. It wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was something far larger. Jalen held the judge's stare, unblinking. No anger, no defiance, just quiet understanding. He had already won. He didn't need to show anything more. In fact, the battle was never about proving a point to anyone in the room. It had always been about getting this moment to exist, to stand as a reminder of something far more crucial than any courtroom victory. As the murmurs grew louder and the press began to gather their bearings, Jalen slowly turned his back to the judge, his feet moving with a quiet purpose. He knew this was his moment to walk out of the room, to leave everything behind. And yet, he didn't rush. He waited, just a few more seconds. "Mr. Dawson?" Jalen paused. His hand rested on the doorframe, but he didn't look back. The voice was calm, but carried a weight of something unsaid, something that neither Jalen nor anyone else in the room could quite decipher. The judge's voice lingered in the air for a heartbeat, as if he too was coming to terms with the fact that this case was something far beyond his expectations. "You ought to think about going to law school." The words hung in the space between them like a riddle, and Jalen, after a brief moment, allowed a knowing smirk to flicker across his face. There was no doubt in his mind about his next step. He had already planned his future long before he stood in that courtroom, knowing that this would only be a stepping stone. But now, the judge had given him another idea, one that was strangely fitting. "Noted," Jalen said quietly, barely more than a whisper. His words weren't dismissive, but they weren't urgent either. He had nothing more to prove. He stepped out of the courtroom, and the reality of what had just transpired began to settle on him. There would be no triumphal shouts, no claps, no loud celebrations. But there would be something more lasting, a quiet realization that he had indeed forced a system to look inward. Outside, the air was thick with the buzz of the press, their voices a wall of questions coming from every angle. The steps leading down to the sidewalk were packed with reporters, their cameras flashing incessantly, microphones thrust forward like spears trying to pierce his every thought. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case?" one of them asked, practically shouting to be heard above the noise. "What are you planning to do next? Will you sue the prosecutor for misconduct?" Another shouted, eager for the next headline. "What's it like, knowing you completely outwitted a seasoned professional?" Jalen didn't flinch. His eyes were focused on the space ahead, ignoring the press, as he began pulling the hood of his sweatshirt over his head. The media had no place in this moment. The attention was nothing more than a distraction, an external noise that could never capture the deeper, more significant weight of what had just happened. He wasn't here for applause, not this time. The true weight of the victory wasn't something that could be caught in a soundbite. It was a quiet realization, a truth that had yet to reach the masses, but one that would, eventually. Through the crowd of flashing cameras, he spotted her. His mother, Denise, standing just a few paces away. Her arms were crossed tightly in front of her, her face unreadable. But there was something there. Something deeper than just concern. Something that only a mother could understand. Jalen's footsteps slowed as he made his way toward her. She didn't move, didn't speak immediately. She just stood there, looking at him with an intensity that made him pause. Her eyes scanned his face, searching for something that she couldn't quite put into words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she shook her head, and with it came a deep, heartfelt sigh. "Boy, you scared me half to death." The words cracked through the intensity of the moment like a sudden release. Jalen couldn't help it. A small laugh escaped his lips. He ran a hand through the back of his hair, trying to brush off the absurdity of the situation. "Had to take a risk, Ma," he replied with a grin, shrugging slightly. She didn't smile. Her expression remained as serious as it had been when he walked into that courthouse. But after a long pause, she closed the distance between them and pulled him into a tight embrace, the weight of her arms grounding him in a way that words never could. "You always were the stubborn one," she murmured softly, the edge of her voice softer than it had been all day. She held him there for just a little longer, as if trying to reassure herself that he was indeed all right. And in that moment, the flashes of cameras and noise of reporters faded away entirely. It was just them, a mother and son, standing on the steps of a courthouse, the world turning around them, but for a brief moment, there was only peace. Across the street, Judge Grayson stood by his car, his eyes trained on the scene. He had yet to move, still processing what had just unfolded. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by something else. Something quieter. Maybe it was introspection. Maybe it was the awareness that Jalen had just shifted the paradigm. What was supposed to be a routine case had now left him with questions that would stay with him long after the gavel fell. He had never expected this outcome. He had expected a quick decision, a simple win for the prosecution, another case closed. But Jalen? He had turned everything upside down. The confidence in the system that had once sat comfortably on Grayson's shoulders now seemed hollow. He couldn't ignore the implications of what had just happened. Jalen hadn't just won the case. He had forced a reckoning on the system. He had made it look at itself, look at its flaws, its biases, and its failings. He had exposed the reality that far too often, justice wasn't served by the evidence alone. It was determined by prejudices, shortcuts, and an inherent failure to dig deep enough to find the truth. Jalen was no longer just a defendant. He was a symbol, a beacon for others who would never get their chance to stand up and be heard. The forgotten cases, the nameless victims of a broken system. And as Grayson watched Jalen disappear into the distance, he realized something. It wasn't enough to simply work within the system anymore. Things had to change. People had to change. Jalen's victory today wasn't just about him. It wasn't about the courtroom. It was about everyone who had ever felt powerless under the weight of the law. Jalen would stand again in front of that same judge, but next time he wouldn't be the defendant. He would be the advocate, the one calling for justice, and he wouldn't stand alone. The next battle was already beginning. If this story has impacted you in even the smallest way, share it. Because this isn't just Jalen's fight, it's everyone's fight. The legal system is only as strong as the people who make it, and the people can change if we demand it. So don't just passively read this, act on it. Because next time, it might not be Jalen standing up for justice. It could be someone you know, someone you love, someone who doesn't have the resources to fight on their own. Let's not let them fall into the cracks. Share this, discuss it, and think about what you can do. Because the truth is, we all have a role to play. We all have a responsibility to make sure justice isn't just a concept, but a reality.